I'm going to give folks another minute. Cabell. So welcome to our to the School of Teacher Ed Colloquium Series Research Talk. The title of Dr. Sonia Cabell's research talk is The Impact of Content-Rich English Language Arts Instruction on Student Learning in the Primary Grades. Dr. Cabell is an assistant professor in the School of Teacher Education and the Florida Center for Reading Research at Florida State University. She has previously worked as a second grade teacher and literacy coach. Dr. Cabell's research focuses on early literacy with a particular interest in preventing reading difficulties among children living in poverty. She has authored over 50 publications and has served as PI or co-PI on grant projects totaling approximately $6 million. Her Twitter handle is @Sonia Cabell. Welcome to Dr. Sonia Cabell.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here. I'm going to share my screen. All right. I'm so thankful for the opportunity to talk to you today. Today, I'm going to be arguing for the importance of systematically building children's content knowledge in order to help their reading development. I'm also going to discuss the research on the impact of content-rich English language arts instruction or content-rich ELA instruction on student learning in the primary grades. But before I get started, I wanted to just acknowledge some contributors. Dr. James Kim and Tom White from Harvard University and the University of Virginia are co-investigators on this, on much of this work I'm presenting. And Dr. Heijin Huang is a postdoctoral scholar and is my colleague on much of the work that I'm presenting here. I also want to thank Charlie Gale, a doc student at Harvard, as well as Marcy Wyatt, who's served as the project manager for this project, which was supported by the Institute of Education Sciences. Customarily, 6 to 8 ushers create the arch. The ushers may be commissioned officers from different branches of service and thus in different uniforms. If that many ushers are not needed, other military guests may be asked in advance to assist the ushers in performing the service. Do you understand what this passage is saying? You might understand all the words, but you might not really know what it's saying. But some of you might know what this is, if you had the right background knowledge. You're right if you said the Arch of Sabers ceremony immediately following a military wedding. And here's my wedding picture from 1998. And yes, there is such a thing as the Army Wife Handbook. And this was probably my very first handbook I ever owned. So we use our background knowledge to read text. Our background knowledge about a particular topic helps us to make inferences and to integrate new knowledge that we learn with the knowledge we already have in order to achieve a deeper level of comprehension. When we don't have the background knowledge for a given text, we have a lot of trouble understanding it or learning from it. In the popular discussion on the science of reading in the early grades, there's been a lot of media attention on children's ability to decode words. And while decoding is an essential part of reading text, there is a clear consensus that children's language comprehension is also critical to successful reading. This is the simple view of reading. It's reading comprehension is a product of decoding, automatic decoding, and listening comprehension or language comprehension. I have to be able to both read words automatically and understand what's being read to become a successful reader. So this presentation today is really focused on the language comprehension component of reading. Some people think about the early elementary years as learning to read and the later elementary years as reading to learn, but this is a false dichotomy. Instruction and comprehension cannot wait until decoding is already in place. We must think about how to foster comprehension during the early years. And when we think about the contributors to language comprehension, we most often are focused on the components of language, such as vocabulary, syntax, or morphology. But background knowledge that a person brings to a text is also essential to understanding it. And reading theories consistently showcase its important role in reading comprehension. In fact, some people think about vocabulary as just the tip of the iceberg of a person's conceptual knowledge. So intentionally and strategically building that knowledge may actually accelerate language learning. But in practice, knowledge has been largely viewed as needing to be simply activated. And what this means is that teachers might ask students to think about what they know about a topic before they read about that topic. But if I don't have the background knowledge for a given text in the first place, how can it be activated? No amount of activation will help me access knowledge that I don't have to begin with. So although we know that background knowledge is an essential component for comprehension, systematically building that knowledge is often left out of the discussion on the science of how to teach reading in the primary grades. So reading instruction is traditionally disconnected from building knowledge in science and social studies. And at the same time, content area instruction often receives a short shrift in the early grades in terms of instructional time. One way that curriculum developers and large districts in the US have been approaching this problem is through implementing content-rich ELA instruction. While this is not a replacement for science and social studies instruction, it presents one way to infuse content area learning into literacy instruction. So here are the key features of content-rich English language arts instruction in the primary grades. Planning units around content concepts, using conceptually coherent text sets on a topic to build knowledge in a logical sequence, engaging students in discussion and writing focused on building knowledge, and explicitly teaching relationships among words around concepts. So the idea here is to leverage literacy instruction to cumulatively learn content. So let's talk briefly about what this looks like and contrast it with typical instruction. So content-rich ELA approaches are focused around content area concepts. So building knowledge is a chief aim of a curriculum and not just one part of it. Concepts might be selected based on standards, and there's generally a logical structure or sequence of the target content. So for example, units might focus on science and social studies topics like farms or Native Americans or Arctic animals. Oh, I spelled Arctic wrong. Those of you who are looking very closely can see that. But typical instruction often focuses on themes instead of concepts. For example, from a popular Basel series, reading series, these are the kinds of things that they focus on. What can we try when we learn new things? And what makes me special? And then the weeks that follow that big idea, maybe they're connected to that big idea, but they're disconnected to one another. So they're not necessarily building knowledge on a particular topic like these content-focused approaches are. Another key feature of a content-rich ELA approach is using coherent text sets. And these can be read aloud to students or students can read them. Here's an example of a coherent text set compiled by my colleague Hei-Jen Huang. So book 1, Growing Vegetable Soup, focuses on what do plants need and how can we help plants? The second book, Plants in the Spring, adds on to it, how can plants help us? The third book, How a Seed Grows, how can different plants help us in different ways? And the fourth book, The Great K-Pop Tree, can ask, how do plants and animals help each other and why should we grow plants? So you can see a coherent text set can include various genres fiction, nonfiction, narrative, and informational texts. Texts are logically ordered to build content knowledge, and you can see how students can use information in previously read texts to understand new learning. Text sets also provide repeated exposure to semantically related vocabulary words. So this is in contrast to traditional approaches, which really hop from topic to topic without tight, coherent text sets. So therefore, students who already come into the classroom with prior knowledge on the topic of the day will be able to learn from that topic of what is being read. In addition, content-rich ELA curricula explicitly teach relationships among words. Because language and knowledge are related, conversations that build knowledge about science and social studies topics can accelerate language skills. So students might be knowledgeable, if they're knowledgeable about plants, they might also know meanings of words like stems and roots. And here's an example of how words can be categorized to teach the explicit relationships among words. So in content-rich ELA programs, there's both a focus on both general purpose words, which are kind of the sophisticated vocabulary that students will see again and again in written language, and content-specific words that are taught. But in contrast, traditional English language arts approaches prioritize general purpose words and don't generally necessarily emphasize relationships among content words. So the point is, as we think about how to teach words and relationships between words, children hear words repeated and understanding deepens through conceptually coherent text sets and explicit vocabulary teaching. In addition, content-rich ELA instruction engages students in rich discussion. Teachers often connect prior learning to new learning and have discussions focused on building content knowledge. Through open-ended questions, extending what children are saying. Traditional approaches may feature rich discussions during interactive read-alouds, but they're not necessarily focused on building content knowledge per se. And finally, engaging students with writing. The purpose of writing is to build knowledge in addition to building literacy. So traditional approaches do not typically have a content focus. So when students are responding to texts in traditional approaches, they're not necessarily building knowledge. Alternatively, if you're talking about Arctic animals, students might, in one study, students wrote an argumentative piece on could you survive in the Arctic? And that was first grade students. So what does the research say about whether content-rich approaches actually improve student learning better than traditional approaches? So let's first consider what we know about approaches that integrate literacy and content knowledge more generally in K-5 settings, not just in English language arts, but anytime during the day. In a meta-analysis conducted by my colleagues, Heijin Huang, Rachel Joyner and I, we've identified there are about 30 studies that had an integrated approach in K-5 settings. Overall, these studies demonstrated significant moderate to large effects on vocabulary and comprehension, including standardized measures of comprehension. If we just considered kindergarten through second grade or the primary grades and the content-rich English language arts approaches, there's really only a handful of studies, about 5, that are experiments or quasi-experiments from which we can draw a causal inference. And although this is a small pool of studies, these studies show promising effects on children's language and knowledge. In fact, the features of content-rich English language arts approaches that I just described were gleaned from these studies. So now I'm going to report on one of the small handful of studies. It's among the first studies to test a widely used, commercially available, content-rich English language arts curriculum, core knowledge language arts. And most prior studies in K2 were conducted using researcher-developed approaches that were not necessarily widely available. Or some of them were supplements to the core reading program. In this case, core knowledge language arts replaced the language comprehension instruction in treatment classrooms. So we conducted 2 RCTs, randomized control trials, examining the effects of CKLA on kindergartners' vocabulary, listening comprehension, and content knowledge. Now, I want to note that I'm not a developer of the materials. I have no horse in this race. This study was independently conducted. We were independent of the publisher Amplify, and we also had a firewall between us and the Core Knowledge Foundation, the curriculum developers. They provided training for the teachers, but they were not involved in the evaluation. In addition, we had another firewall between those who implemented the curriculum, the implementation team, and those who conducted the analyses. So when you think back about the simple view of reading, Core Knowledge Language Arts has 2 strands, one that addresses decoding, the skill strand, and one that addresses the language comprehension side, the knowledge strand. And again, we tested the knowledge strand only. And we also asked schools to do what they normally did for phonics instruction. They were asked to replace the read aloud, what they were doing for read aloud and language comprehension, with the knowledge strand while keeping intact the decoding. So what is the CKLA knowledge strand? It is a content-rich ELA program that has all those features we talked about and provides interactive read-alouds with the opportunity to just question and discuss and share ideas. There's a lot of discussion among students during the program. It exposes students to people, cultures, ideas, and events from all over the world, past and present, develops knowledge in science and social studies, and introduces students to stories and tales and poems. So simply because units are focused on science or social studies topic doesn't mean they don't have narrative text. In fact, they do. Stories are also built in, and I will show you that, an example of that later. It also provides access to academic language, and that's the complex use of complex syntax and vocabulary to learn the language of written text. So one of the features of this program is that it coherently builds knowledge within a year. So if you look at the kindergarten column, students learn about Columbus and Pilgrims later in the sequence. Unlike traditional instruction, sometimes students learn about Columbus on Columbus Day toward the beginning of the year. But before you get to Columbus and the Pilgrims, there's instruction about kings and queens, and before you get, and also about Native Americans. Before you get there, there's instruction about farms, and before you get there, there's instruction about plants. So one thing that distinguishes this curriculum is that sequencing of knowledge. Even this, it distinguishes this curriculum from other content-rich ELA curricula. It also is designed to build knowledge across years, from kindergarten to through grade 2, and I'll give you a few examples here. You can see that those concepts and domains are recurring and building. There's also coherent text sets that build connections among words, and relationships among words are explicitly taught. The materials can be seen here, that there's a teacher's guide that has the read aloud in it, along with extra places where teachers should pause and ask questions, make comments. This is referred to as extra textual talk, the talk that's outside of the text itself. And students are looking at rich images in from a flip book, or this can all be projected on a screen. So it's not like the typical read aloud where you hold a book and then turn it around. There's 60 minutes of daily instruction. And you can see there's an introduction to the read aloud itself, and then there's an application activity that often involves writing. And so this was our theory of change, our logic model for this study. And you can see the intervention components here, as well as the underlying processes that we hypothesized would impact student learning. And that is these coherent knowledge building and emphasis on semantic networks, meaning that the curriculum is building and knowledge systematically within and across grades, and then through repeated exposure to words represented in a larger domain would build children's vocabulary. And in this particular, what we're reporting out is the kindergarten findings of the study. So participants in these two randomized control trials were from large urban districts in the United States. You can see there the racial breakdown, as well as the free and reduced lunch district. The study one took place in a very high poverty district. So these two studies were identical with one another. They both had pre-test collected in the fall, which served as a baseline. Then schools were randomly assigned to condition in November. And again, from the prior slide, you saw that we had a total of 47 schools in this study. Approximately, there was 1 semester of intervention delivered by teachers from December through May, with the post-test happening in the spring. And here's a sense of the units and the topics. And as you can see, for example, that there's a mix of both informational text and narrative text. For example, in the 5 senses, they learn about sight, hearing, smell, taste, touch, but they also talk about Ray Charles and Helen Keller. And in this study, it was really the plants through the seasons and weathers topics that were delivered fully prior to the post-test. Teachers received two full days of training, and they met with the facilitator once every 2 weeks to help with planning. They generally adhered to curricular principles while delivering the read aloud lessons. And we gave both proximal and distal measures. Proximal measures are generally researcher developed measures and align with what the intervention was. So for example, we tested for vocabulary, we gave them a test of the words that were taught in the curriculum. But distal measures are those standardized measures, often standardized and norm reference measures, that are one step removed from the actually what was taught. And we gave the PPVT and Woodcock-Johnson picture vocabulary for receptive and expressive vocabulary. For listening comprehension, we did not have a proximal measure. We only had distal measures of the test of narrative language and the self-sentence structure. To measure content knowledge, we had a proximal measure developed that it was adapted by Cervetti, Wright, and Huang, and Heijin Huang developed this particular measure for our purposes. We asked students to tell me everything you know about plants and tell me everything you know about Native Americans, and we coded those ideas. And for our distal measure, we used the Woodcock-Johnson tests of science and social studies. So our analyses were multi-level modeling with students nested within schools. We had very little missing data and no significant differential attrition. So as I talk about results, I'm going to share with you some effect sizes. And I remember the researcher Steve Graham once talking about effect sizes as dancing on the moon if you get large effects. But if you get small effects, you're still dancing. In education research, small effects still are meaningful. And in general, we expect larger effects for proximal measures, those measures that are more highly aligned, like the words that they were taught or the content that was taught. But oftentimes, studies will not show effects on standardized measures. So let me talk to you about the results here. So study 1, and the tests of word taught, our proximal measures were significant in study 1 and 2. And there was a significant effect of expressive vocabulary and the distal measure in study 2. For listening comprehension, there were no discernible effects on either study 1 and study 2, and we only had distal measures. And in terms of content knowledge, we had moderate to large effects on proximal measures and no significant effects in individual studies. But we also pooled results across the studies and combined the results to improve precision around the estimated treatment effect and saw significant effects on both expressive vocabulary as well as science knowledge in the distal outcomes. And of course, all the proximal outcomes remain significant. And again, these effect sizes are small, but lest you think that it's not very meaningful and not worth dancing about, let's compare it to the extant literature. So in the extant literature in this area, small effects, we see small effects on students' standardized vocabulary, like actually negative 0.05 on distal measures. On large scaled randomized control trials, the average effect on kindergarten in general is 0.01, and on language is 0.01, the average effect. So the fact that we saw effects of 0.09 and 0.12 after one semester of intervention was very promising to us, especially considering a lot of language intervention. Language intervention on its own rarely produces significant effects on standardized measures of vocabulary. So overall, there are consistently more positive results from study 2, although the patterns are similar across both studies. The pooled effects indicate significant effects on both proximal and distal measures of vocabulary and knowledge. The lack of listening comprehension measures may be due to many factors. One might be poorly aligned, poor alignment of measures. Another might be it's just not enough time to impact the listening comprehension yet. And in fact, if you think about our theory of change, it happens supposed to happen over time. Knowledge and language take time to build. So I was quite surprised that we saw effects on standardized measures after just one semester of intervention. And so this provides some evidence of efficacy for a widely used curriculum in the United States. It also adds to the sparse literature base on knowledge building in English language arts instruction, particularly in kindergarten. And this is part of a longitudinal study that examined multiple years of curriculum exposure. However, we did continue intervention in study 2 into first grade, but we were unable to collect children's data due to COVID. We are hopeful that we'll be able to look at potential sustained effects through district data, but we're just not sure yet, largely due to COVID. So let's go back to where we began. The knowledge that you bring to a text is a key determinant in how much you understand the text. When we systematically build students' content knowledge in English language arts instruction, this integration may be a more powerful approach than traditional literacy instruction. So let's widen our lens on the science of how to teach reading to include building knowledge and language through integrating content area teaching into English language arts instruction. And remember, it doesn't take away anything from reading instruction to also make it content rich. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Cabell. So we now have time, 30 minutes for questions and discussion. Anybody like to drop something in the chat or unmute and ask Dr. Cabell questions?
Thank you. I have a quick question. Really cool stuff that you're doing. I appreciate you sharing it with us.
Thank you.
I specifically am interested in the effect size estimates that you shared, sort of cited in there. Could you send like full references for those? I'm interested in the.
You mean the effect size references from other studies?
Yeah, for like proximal and distal outcomes, sort of for contextualizing effect size estimates.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. The study that I cited was Lorty, I don't know how to say this properly, Lorty, Forgues, and Inglis in 2019. I believe it was in Ed Researcher. I think if Heijin Huang is here in the audience, she might be able to drop it in the chat. Matt Kraft, yes, I'm aware of the Matt Kraft article in Ed Researcher related to effect sizes. Thanks for dropping that in the chat, Rob. And so the extent to which, so that's an interesting one because they estimate a much smaller effect size as being meaningful in education research. And in a study in the meta-analysis led by Dr. Heijin Huang, in our reviews, we have gotten a little bit of pushback using his effect size, his magnitude of effect size estimates in terms of characterizing results. But yeah, I can definitely share a link to that article that I'm talking about.
Thank you.
Sonia, Sherry asked if you've worked with districts to help them understand the importance of these results for teachers' practices in the early grades. If you could talk about that.
I think it's tricky there. I think our study hit COVID and also hit district leadership changes. So our ability to go back to the district and speak with the teachers about the findings was limited. They also adopted, in both districts, our study also hit textbook adoption. And they both adopted a different content-rich English language arts curriculum. And so therefore, we're no longer interested in implementing core knowledge language arts. So they both districts adopted a program called Wit and Wisdom, which is one of there's only a handful in this space of content-rich ELA. So while the district is very kind of cued in to building content-rich English language arts instruction in both of our districts we worked in, the extent to which they viewed our results as being only about core knowledge and not about informing the larger knowledge base is, so we didn't necessarily have the opportunity to go back to those teachers at those districts, but I am talking with more broadly about these findings, like I've shared today, in the context of this is another piece of evidence for content-rich ELA instruction. Not necessarily everybody should go out and buy this curriculum, but rather I think that the results from this are also in keeping with those the few other promising studies of content-rich approaches developed by researchers, as well as there's another large IES study on a program called ARC Core, which is also another one in the content-rich space. And they have not published their findings yet, but I think their findings for kindergarten are generally positive as well.
Sonia, thank you. We had another question about how you train the teachers to implement the intervention, and then a couple others are also coming through. So I'll come back to those in just a second.
Right. So training teachers to implement the intervention, we partnered with the Core Knowledge Foundation, who are the developers of the curriculum. For Core Knowledge Language Arts, Amplify, the publisher, usually gives the training. They have all rights to the training, but we get special permission to just work with to kind of have that firewall with Amplify and just work with Core Knowledge Foundation. So we worked with Core Knowledge Foundation to build out this training a little bit more than the typical training that they would normally give. So normally, while they might receive initial training on this content, on this strand of the curriculum, for a half day, we built it out into 2 full days, one that happened prior to the curriculum, and then one that curriculum implementation, and then one that happened about after a month that they were implementing the intervention. We also had just facilitators that we hired. I don't call them coaches because I don't want to use the word coaching, implies a lot. We had facilitators who met with grade level teams weekly. Who met with grade level teams every 2 weeks to plan for the next 2 weeks of instruction. So that's how the training looked like in the kindergarten year. It's interesting with districts, different districts have different supports in terms of whether they have a reading coach or literacy coach in the building or not. Second district we were in, when we moved to the first grade, we also layered on the district, the coach also attended trainings. We also worked with an organization, partnered with an organization called TNTP that was already in the district and provided additional supports for teachers that were contextually important to that district. All that to say is this was considered an efficacy trial and not an effectiveness trial. One of the differences being an efficacy trial is one where you try to make the situation more ideal. So you're actually testing the intervention, versus effectiveness is where you say, I want to let the process play out, as give them the intervention as they normally would get it from the, so we did a little bit more, we kind of walked a line between what they would get in real life and giving them more so that they would have fidelity to the curriculum. We also monitored that fidelity. There's the, okay, so I see Christy Andrews Larson's comment about anti-racist and culturally responsive pedagogy. Okay, I wonder if you can comment on the relation to the differences I saw between the two groups, particularly considering some of the examples of the foci of texts. Can you comment on the differences in whose history is told, implications you might think have from learning of different groups of students? I am, aware that this particular curriculum and the history of this curriculum came out of E.D. Hirsch's work in the 80s and 90s, and he's the founder of Core Knowledge Foundation. And there was a lot of criticism then of core knowledge in general. The curriculum itself was released in 2010 to 2012, and it was done in response to funding from Race to the Top through New York State. At that time, and throughout all of the 2000s, the foundation had worked very hard to get teacher voices and broadening the scope. And they also had a lot of diversity represented in the curriculum in terms of different viewpoints. Now, I don't necessarily speak to whose knowledge to teach, and that is a question a lot of people debate. I just know that I worked with districts who had already started implementing this particular curriculum in some degree in their district, and wanted to expand it to other schools. So I worked with districts that wanted this particular curriculum. The district administration and many of the students were African American, and I never got pushback from the districts about the content. There was only the discussion of wanting to add other content information to it, and there were some controversial topics in first grade. But it was interesting because some districts viewed it as controversial in one way, and another district will view it as controversial in a completely opposite way, and it had to do with religion. So we ended up dropping some content in the first grade sequence because of that. Yeah, so. Oh, but I guess to more fully answer your question, I don't think that's why there's differences between the two groups. I think the differences between the two groups really rest in the contextual supports that the second district had. They had literacy coaches in their buildings. They had a lot of more professional training and planning throughout the year. It was a different, very different context professionally for teachers than our first district. I personally think that those were some of the factors that probably contributed to the stronger effects in the second group.
And thank you, Sonia. There's a question about how you coded responses to your background knowledge assessment and about assessing background knowledge in general, if you can talk more about that.
Yes, actually, I don't know if I don't want to put Heijin on the spot if she doesn't want to be put on the spot, but Heijin Huang developed this coding, and Heijin, if you want to chime in, I welcome that. But the coding was done with, we asked children to tell us everything you know about plants, for example, and children just started talking. We had a protocol that talked about how many times the assessor could repeat the prompt, and then we coded for idea units of what children said in relation to what was presented in the curriculum. So not just, so it was idea units that were factual and related to the curriculum. Heijin, do you want to add anything to that?
You pretty much summarized it very well.
Thank you, Heijin. And I think Heijin is a wonderful collaborator and a partner with me in this work. In terms of assessing background knowledge in general,
Thank you.
in terms of assessing background knowledge in general, I find this very problematic. There is no great standardized tools. I would say Woodcock-Johnson provides what people consider the, you know, if there is a gold standard in terms of the standardized tests, but it's really problematic because it really depends on the knowledge you have and the knowledge you're being taught. So if someone could please come up with really great assessments on science and social studies knowledge that we, or knows of any that I can continue to probe. But when I looked for these validated assessment tools that were distal measures, it was really hard to find. I also had trouble thinking through what we could measure in terms of their listening comprehension proximally, meaning aligned with the intervention.
Hey,
I was at
Hey, Nicole.
okay, I have a question. Thank you so much. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you ended up doing this project. So this is a massive multi-state thing that, and you know, it's on an existing curriculum on a shelf, right? And so what we all know is that we don't have enough evidence on efficacy or effectiveness of things that are out there in schools that people are doing right now. So how do you just happen to run this project? Like, how does that happen? Can you talk to us about that?
Yes, and particularly sometimes people ask me, but your previous work was not on building knowledge, and that's true as well. Okay, so my work has been around language and building children's language. So when you think about the R equals D times C, I was still working on the C camp, but I was looking at language interventions, particularly in preschools. And one of the frustrating things about the language interventions that we were seeing across the board, in the intervention that I was a part of, it was training teachers to be responsive conversational partners with children. And we would train teachers to have richer back and forth exchanges. But one of the issues around that and other approaches that were going on at the same time was that it wasn't having an effect on actually improving distal outcomes in children's language. It was children would talk more in the classroom, and they might say a more, different kinds of words in the classroom, more diversity in what they're talking about. So, but when you actually look at, does it change their vocabulary more generally? Does it change? We didn't see those effects. There were very few studies that saw those effects. And some of those studies that saw those effects, some of them tended to do this thing where they also were talking about content. I will never forget that in a Society for Research and Child Development meeting, maybe it was in, 2011, 2010, somewhere along the lines of that. I was in a symposium talking, I was giving a presentation on our kind of lackluster findings in the preschool language space, and the next presenter did the same thing, and the next presenter did the same thing. And the famous Catherine Snow from Harvard, she was our discussant. And she said something that really stuck with me. She said, what if we give children and teachers something to talk about? And that kind of put a light bulb in my, well, it made a light bulb go off in my mind. And then I began to be interested in studying both how different contexts might be more facilitative of teachers' language. And I did find in my own work that the science context was actually seemed to be more facilitative of teachers using richer conversational language modeling with children back and forth. And so I then began, the Core Knowledge Foundation is in Charlottesville, Virginia, where I lived for many years before coming to FSU. And I began to learn that about that curriculum, and their knowledge strand was doing something unique in the space, even before all of the other ones that are competitors in the same space. I think Core Knowledge was still among the very first ones to kind of promote this idea in the English language arts space. So I became really interested in there, and I just I began to write a grant for this, and those of you who are students on this call, it takes many years to get grants funded, and I was part of many large federal grant projects before my own were getting funded. And so, yeah, I don't know if that fully answers your question, but I came at it with a language standpoint, from a language standpoint. And I've partnered with Jimmy Kim, Tom White, and Heijin Huang. Heijin really has a very much a knowledge background, knowledge and literacy. So I feel like the team that we have is really a rich one to study both language and knowledge in different, kind of from different angles.
So I have about 10 minutes here. So thank you, Sonia, so far. Great discussion. Anybody else?
Okay, I have one more, but I didn't want to monopolize.
No,
So-
monopolize, Nicole.
Right.
Yeah.
So what's next, right? So given what your findings are thus showing you, I'm trying to think of it from a research trajectory kind of standpoint. So I'm sure this has piqued your interest in so many different ways. So like, what's the next study? Because you can go in a million different directions, but what's your next step for this work?
So I feel like this is a question I consistently ask myself, right? And when you think about your own work, you end up thinking about very similar ideas over and over again. And you realize, oh, that's the core of what I'm interested in. It's the ideas that keep on coming to the surface again and again. And I write them down, and then I look back and see, oh, I wrote down the same thing. The other day I was writing a note to a colleague who wants to write a book. And I said, well, these are the topics I want to write on. And I thought they were all different. I thought one was about writing. I thought one was about knowledge building. And actually all of them are could be subsumed under the same kind of header of understanding how to integrate these areas more fully in order to help listening comprehension. So in terms of this particular project, I feel like we have a lot of dissemination to go and a lot of understanding to go. We have information about what teachers whether this kind of a curriculum that's also has some educative features, helps teachers transfer their learning into other instructional practices in terms of other read alouds that they're doing. So we're going to look at teacher effects. We are also hoping that we'll be able to see if there's a longitudinal effect here if we are able to secure the data from districts as valid and reliable in reading comprehension. In terms of other studies that I'm interested in doing, obviously other things that would build on this work would be to do this sort of study with another curriculum. One thing that I learned from this process is I really began to understand why researchers do not, why there's very few studies that are longitudinal, meaning the child gets intervention over multiple grades. So originally this work was supposed to be K through 2. The reality on the ground of going from K through 2 with the same participants and the same district without there being political upheaval, district upheaval, or pandemics you can't control. That was a totally different one. But even without the pandemic, the reality of doing studies over multiple years is very difficult. So I'm very proud that we got through the end of first grade. But really, it took me a long time to get over the fact that we don't have post-test data on the children, end of first grade. But they have an intervention in kindergarten and in first grade. I think that future studies should study longitudinally knowledge and language, if possible. You could study other content-rich English language arts widely used programs. Something I'm interested in is developing supplemental writing curricula in both the pre-K and K space that would also involve content-rich features. That would be a way to reinforce content as well as writing, because I think that students also get a short shrift in writing in the early grades. And I think that there's a lot to leverage about writing for literacy learning. And then I think I would love to study, a lot of my research is in the pre-K space. I would love to study pre-K programs that integrate literacy and knowledge. And so I'm looking at doing that as well. Those of you who are interested in this area, this is a small but small body of literature compared to other areas of reading, but it is very promising. And so I would encourage you, if you have any interest at all in this, I would encourage you to read on this topic. I'm happy to share my paper on this topic. I would encourage you to think about this area, because it is this idea of, can we integrate? Do we get more from integrating language and knowledge? And another piece of what I want to unpack is, if we get more, why do we get more? What's the facilitative, what's the mechanism, a mechanism? And I think a mechanism that I want to unpack further is the idea that teachers' language, the teachers and children's language in content areas can be more conducive of language learning, or at least academic language learning, that would help prepare them for written texts.
Sonia, this makes me think of some work way back. Nancy Romance and Dick Vitale in South Florida. That was multi-district work. So you're shaking your head. That's the reason I had asked my question, because that was done when I was in graduate school. That tells you how old it is. And I thought that was just that they answered the question of whether it works to teach reading and science together in robust ways.
Yes,
because you get gains in science and you get great gains in reading, and districts still, that's not been taken up.
Right. And Vitale and Romance are among those very few that have their 2012 study is an experimental study, I believe, not a quasi-experimental study, that is one of those handful of studies that looks at a content-rich ELA approach. However, they also have other studies that are in our broader corpus of studies.
Mm-hmm.
Paper on the meta-analysis led by Heijin Huang. Their work definitely emerges as one of those promising work. And I think that there just needs to be more in this area.
Is it more research that's needed? Although I would say yes, or better outreach to districts to help them interpret, or? I
think it's both. So
okay.
recently, my colleagues at the Florida Center for Reading Research and I, we wrote a paper looking at the what's compelling in the science of reading, what's not so compelling, and compelling evidence, not so compelling evidence, and promising evidence. And that promising evidence is where I situated this kind of work. This is promising. It's not yet like slam dunk out the door compelling. In fact, let me give you another viewpoint that I recently had with Dr. Tim Shanahan. He said to me, is it that these integrative programs, his argument is around, is it that it's about the integrative of the programs, or are these programs also doing all these other things, which are also good for reading? And so I think that needs to be unpacked better. And so I would say that both more and there needs to be some translation of the work, which I'm trying to do what I can to help translate some of that. But I do think that there has been this huge uptick in English language arts curricular content rich. However, I was also another colleague made sure I understood that, this is a Band-Aid on a problem, not a solution to the problem. Meaning, what we really need potentially are integrated curricula across our day. When we think about the pre-K space, we have that in general. But when we think about the K-12 space, there's textbook adoption for ELA. There's, these things are completely siloed. And so students in an ELA program might jump from topic to topic that has nothing to do about what they're learning in science, if they're learning science.
They're not learning in science.
Right. And in both of the large districts I was in the primary grades, there was very little science or social studies instruction going on, particularly in those young kindergarten, first grade grades. And I'm not saying that all the traditional reading programs are bad. I think that they do, that several of, I just reviewed one very closely, and they do a lot of good things, but they're not necessarily designed to build content. They're designed, that's not their push. And so my question becomes like, is it the reason why I think that Hagen and I were trying to isolate in the meta-analyses these studies that integrated, because they were doing that was one of those pieces that they were doing, integrating content and literacy, and to what extent does that show an effect over what the traditional literacy instruction took place? I think that there's something important to that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I have a question for you. I was taught science ed at Florida State for 34 years, and we developed a lot of curriculum materials. And I'm interested in what you're talking about. Have you known anyone to look at the effect of coupling the text and learning with hands-on activities?
Yes, in fact, the several of the studies, I think Romance and Vitale have a good example of that. I think that Carol Connor and colleagues in her work on CALI, content area literacy instruction, that model did that. I think Jimmy Kim's model of Moore, just published in 2020, when students were learning about Arctic animals, doing that. So across these, one of the features I left out that does reoccur across a few of these is ideas of this hands-on learning. But I'm reminded of something that I think that Sherry said that has stuck in my mind for years, which is, I view this world from a literacy reading person's perspective. What we really need is science and literacy perspectives to be better integrated, so that, the things you're talking about in science education are, you're actually meeting the content standards for science and literacy at the same time. A program like Core Knowledge Language Arts is not designed to do that. It's designed to supplement whatever science you're doing, or science and social studies, but it's not designed to meet, for example, NGSS standards. Whereas you want to, I think that's why the work of the Science Ideas work is so nice by Romance and Vitale, because they're actually integrating both in more authentic ways that would lend it to both disciplines well. I'm not sure, Sherry, if I'm reflecting what you told me many years ago.
For science educators, it's always when you read, not if you read, but when you read. And the reading comes after students have built the concept through activity and discussion with one another. And once they have the ideas and vocabulary and background knowledge, then they can take those ideas to the text. That's, for us, a nice flow of activity. And I think that's what Nancy and Mike did so well in their work. And Nancy always does a really good job of being sure that students are engaged in the practices of thinking like a scientist, which involves reading, but after we have some ideas about what we're reading. So reading doesn't drive what they learn, but it is reinforcing what they're learning.
And I would say another program is Seeds of Science, Roots of Reading by Pearson and colleagues, is another potential program that would combining those authentically. Again, a lot of these programs, though, are not commercially available programs.
Well, the ones you suggested, I can't listen and write down at the same time. If you would just send me a couple references, I'll look them up.
I will be happy to do that.
It's gdawson@fsu.edu.
Great, I will do that.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, we actually are a little over our 1 hour, so I appreciate everyone joining us. Stay tuned. We'll be sending out announcements. Our March talk will be from Dr. Emily Plummer-Catania, and then we will end the semester in April with Dr. Jenny Root. So we'll be sending all that information around in the next few weeks or so, at least for March.
No one's interested in my girlfriend.
You mean
We
your
wouldn't
back?
presume, George, to question your choices.
What's that?
Just
We
in the
wouldn't
background.
presume to question your choices.
I couldn't hear.
Okay.
I left my hearing aids out and I didn't want to get up and go get them. So anyway, I met this lady on a path in the jungles in Borneo. And she
Did you
was
take the
she's
picture?
actually carrying, if you look carefully on her over her right cheek, there's a little baby back there.
Oh, yeah, there is.
Can't make it out. She's got so much hair on her, she hides the kid. Anyway, that's it.
Did you take the picture?
Yeah,
Wow.
yes. My wife and I like to travel to remote areas. And we've done a lot of it. Anyway.
I like to think
well,
I'm part of that, George, because I came and took your job so that you could go and be free and see the
That's-
world.
that's
That's how I
right,
like to think of
but-
it. So-
thanks to FSU, I got to travel a lot in the world. And
Mhm.
at the time, I'll just make this quick. We had a adaptation of one of our programs in Australia, and we're about equal distance either way you go around the world. So that allowed a trip around the world. And the planes couldn't fly like they do from LA all the way down to Sydney. So you stopped in places and you wouldn't get penalized if you got off the plane for 2 or 3 days, like in Fiji, and then pick up the next flight going or one you want. It came every day. So I got to see a lot of South Pacific just on those works. Anyway, I look forward to the next seminar.
Must have been nice.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you all.